As we get started, just a little bit of a story. So I don't have any slides because I was working on finishing up my slides. I had my tablet PC, and I went to go to Google where my slides are. I have them, I pull them down, work on them, whatever. And it's like certificate error. Okay, that's weird. My cache certificate error. Let me clear everything. Certificate error. So I'm pretty sure my tablet's infected with some pretty bad virus or malware or something. I'm not even opening up until I format it. And so no slides. We'll begin. We'll do it old fashioned. I have my notes up here, so that's all good. But that is actually kind of a prime example of like one of the things I'm talking about. Like as a musician, I can't tell you how many times things just go horribly wrong, and you just need to roll with it. I've had amps burn up and die on stage. I've blown speakers on stage. Guitars got electric shock through the microphone before. You just kind of roll with it. So I'm rolling with it today. So yeah, getting started. So I'm Jared Huntley. I'm a game developer from Cleveland, Ohio. Full-time, I teach at a coding boot camp called We Can Code It. But I also teach game development part-time at a community college. So I teach game development classes, game programming, things like that. I'm the current head organizer of the Cleveland Game Developers. That's just the logo I decided to pull up there, so it's a little bit not completely boring of a background. And it's just an open group of game developers, artists. We're focused on education, community, things like that. We do game jams. But today, I really come to you as a musician. So music, I've been playing music my whole life. Starting out with just playing hand drums. I took piano lessons, but my main instrument is bass guitar. So I've been playing bass for about 14, 15 years at this point. I've played out in a number of bands, gigs all around Cleveland, Columbus, things like that. And the other interesting thing is, so I play in a band called Jewel Big Green. Jewel is actually my brother. So my younger brother is an indie musician. Solo, he plays about 200 shows per year. As a full band, we play, at least once or twice a month, sometimes 3 times a month. But once I started getting into indie game development, I realized, hey, we're doing a lot of the same things. And I started looking into it a little bit further, realizing that there's a lot of parallels, and I started, kind of picking it apart and realizing, the game industry is really young. It hasn't been around a lot, and we're figuring out a lot of things as we encounter them. And just looking at the world of music, I realized that, hey, they're doing a lot of the same things, and there's probably a lot we can learn from them, lessons and just techniques. So those are some of the things I want to talk about today. So I want to start out talking about one of my friends. He had a project he was working on. He had a full-time job, was working on it in his spare time. He was self-funding it, working with his friends. As people were able to work on his project, they come in and out, work on it for a couple of years, and was able to release it. Got some press for it. Was able to tour around with it a little bit, and unfortunately, the project didn't take off. It didn't change the whole world, but he was happy, really proud of his project. But he had to go back and pick up some more hours at work, and he's continuing working on his next project. So we're at a game development conference. You might assume I'm talking about a game. I'm actually talking about one of my friends who released a record. He had a record that he was working on. Worked on the record with a number of different friends. They jump in and out, and he was self-funding it, and it follows a lot of the same parallels of working on an indie game. And so, for those of you who aren't familiar with indie musicians or indie music, just a little caveat: when I'm talking about music and indie musicians, I'm specifically talking, about rock, and more specifically, the indie rock metal scene, because those are most of the musicians I'm friends with and kind of the bands I've played in and things like that. Depending on the genres you're talking about, these rules and lessons might vary a little bit, but a lot of them hold true. So an indie musician at his base level is just someone who's independent, who's producing music on their own. They might be backed by a label, but not necessarily a large label. A lot of times their projects are self-funded. A lot of times they're self-taught, things like that. With indie musicians, a lot of times they form groups. And so you might be in a similar situation with some other musicians. You decide to get together, form a band, work on a project, and continue from there. And that sounds a lot like what we do with game developers. We bond on a shared vision and we work towards a specific goal. And a lot of times it's cash-strapped. You're working from the bottom up, but you have a vision and you work to make that vision hold true. Obviously, a lot of us will be familiar with an indie game developer, or what an indie game developer is, and a lot of those same rules hold true, where a lot of indie musicians are self-taught, a lot of game developers are self-taught, a lot of indie musicians are self-funded, they're working with peers, the same thing with game developers. Also, when it comes to marketing and self-promotion, that's a really big one. So with indie musicians, especially if they're not backed by a label, they're doing a lot of the marketing and self-promotion themselves. So musicians, they self-book tours, they go from city to city, they're showing their wares, they're building their fan base. The same with game developers. We have our products, we self-book our tours to different expos, and we show our projects off. And it's really the same kind of cycle of working on a project, working with the team. It doesn't really matter, how much cash, but the passion's there, and you're working with your friends and building kind of a super group to release these projects. All right, for those of you who missed it a little bit earlier, I had a PC disaster, so I don't have slides, so going old-fashioned. All right, so, basically what I'm saying is, as an indie developer, are you kind of the same as an indie rock star? Yes, you can call yourself an indie rock star. I'm giving you permission. But there's really a lot of parallels, and I think as game developers, there's a lot of things that we can learn from indie musicians. Since, the indie music industry, more or less has been around since, the early 60s, I'd say. And a lot of these musicians have been doing stuff, some of them since the early 60s, that we can kind of learn from. So one of the, I think, important things is most indie musicians have full-time jobs. Depending on the type of job, you have different levels of flexibility. If you have a full-time job, maybe you can just play shows in the evening, you can play shows in the weekends. Sometimes you might be able to take off a Friday and do a weekend tour, something like that. If you have a remote job, you have a lot more flexibility. I know a number of friends in bands who have remote jobs, and so they're able to work while they're on tour. They work from their tour bus, and they're able to tour around and play shows in the evening. Or sometimes they just have part-time jobs where they're able to self-book tours and schedule their work schedules around when they're self-booking those tours. And I think the important thing to consider with this is in the indie music industry, it's the norm that you have a job. It's not expected that you release your first album and you're able to absolutely quit and sustain yourself full time. Some indie musicians are able to sustain themselves full time. Others are completely fine with having music be just as an important part of their life as anything else, but they're not using it as their primary means of sustaining itself. The band will definitely sustain itself, will be able to pay for its gear, but they're not necessarily relying on it as their only source of income. Even when you're talking about signed artists, a lot of times signed artists have full-time jobs as well. They might work with a label to fly to Europe or to Asia to do a tour, but they still have their full-time jobs, they still have commitments, and that's just kind of how the industry accepts it. Another kind of point on that is bands oftentimes aren't rich at all. A lot of times when we're talking about cash strapped, we're talking about really, really cash strapped. One of my best friends in the band, we actually met when they were on tour. They went through Canada. Their car broke down. Their amp blew up and needed a specialized repair. They had a debacle at the hotel where they got triple charged because they tried to hide too many band members in the hotel room. So they were out of cash, and they came to tour into Cleveland, where I'm from. They needed a place to stay. I called my parents. My mom kind of freaked out that a metal band wanted to stay at the house, but she actually really enjoyed them, still talks about them today, saying that they're the nicest people I ever invited over. But the story is that that they were doing a self-book tour, they were backed by a label, things went wrong, but they made it work. They were able to crash with somebody, and my friend Jake and I have been able to keep in contact, so I bounced ideas off of self-funding things and passion projects off of him, and we're able to talk the same language, me being a game developer and him being an indie musician. Also, when it comes to money and musicians not being rich, a lot of that has to do with perception. Sometimes there's a divide between the consumers and the actual producers, to where the consumers see, there's a band, they're flying to Europe, they're doing a tour, they're signed to a label, they must be rich. I remember talking with some kids, and they were talking about touring to, and this was years ago, but they're talking about touring to this album, like, yo, you should go out and buy the album. They're like, no, they're rich. And I'm like, I've met them before. They're definitely not rich. They are on a self-book tour, and I kind of explain to these kids, this is their passion project. So, just like piracy hurts indie game developers, it hurts musicians just as bad. Because a lot of it is these just kind of these passion trips, these self-booked projects and things like that. And so, you might have a band that's playing with a large international touring group or something like that, and you still have that perception where they've made it, they've made a lot of money, they're doing this full time, and that's kind of what the consumers see. But on the flip side, it's a bunch of dudes or gals doing what they do, enjoying it, but making it work. And that's kind of the same thing we see with game developers. We see game developers winning IGF awards or things like that, and that's absolutely awesome, but we still have problems with piracy and sell-through rates and things like that that definitely affect us in the same way. Sales, that's one of the things that I did some looking into, and it's kind of hard to compare album sales to game sales, because they're fairly different industries. And so sales don't necessarily map one-to-one. But the thing to keep in mind about sales is just setting your sales expectations. A lot of times, a band will produce an album, and then after that they'll book a tour, and their sales expectations are based on being able to sustain them on the tour. So rather than looking at, I want to make this much money, or rather than looking at it where I want to make this many sales, they say, hey, we need this amount of money to get us from stop A to stop B to stop C, and they calculate it as kind of an ongoing rate. And so that's a different way of looking at sales that I don't necessarily see a lot of indie game developers doing. So looking at sales not so much as, this is how many units I want to sell, but how many units do I want to sell per month, or what kind of rolling basis do I want to have. For bands, that's to be able to continue their tour, because if they stop making money selling albums, they might get stuck. For game developers, that can be ongoing development, like fixing, hiring on team members to do things like community management, marketing, and things like that. Another thing that I think we can learn as game developers from indie musicians is how to get started. I hear a lot of times, game developers asking, how do I get started? How do I get started? Where do I start? What do I study? Things like that. I think the most important thing is to just start. Whenever you want to start learning how to get into a band, you pick an instrument, you learn it, and you just start learning how to learn that instrument. And it's just part of the process that it's not, you have to figure out, where you want your first tour to be or the first, venue you want to play on stage. It's this thing where, musicians look at it from the bottom up instead of, a lot of times game developers look at, hey, I want to make this, grand game or something like that. And it's also great, to have ideas about the games you want to make, but rather than looking at it from the top down with, there's this experience I want to create, we can look at it from, what are the skills that are going to get me to this project that I eventually want to create. Another thing is that kind of ties together the expectations and the getting started is musicians, I think, do a lot better job with starting small on a project and building larger and larger projects. And this is a feels warning. I feel a lot of game developers, want to work on a game, release it, and change the world with their first game. That's definitely possible, but a lot of times it takes practice and it takes iteration to build up those skills to produce a project like that. I don't meet very many musicians who learn their first instrument, join a band, and then they're upset they can't, sign to Sony and go on tour full time. So I think a lot of game developers can really, maybe my first game, I'll sell 150 copies, maybe my second game, I'll work on 500 copies or something like that. My third game, working up to 1,000 copies. And enjoying the process of building those skills, building your skill set, building your tool belt of basically techniques you have to attack bigger and bigger problems as you kind of work on building your skills. Another thing that I think game developers can learn from indie musicians is the distinction between a hobby versus real game developers. I've heard a lot of people, say, "Oh, you're not doing game development full time. You're not a real game developer," or "Oh, you're just doing game development as a hobby." And that kind of has like a derogatory, term to it. It kind of has a sting, and there's absolutely no reason it should be like that. I have literally never heard the term hobby musician. Like, never. There's no such thing as a hobby musician. You're just a musician. And I think it should be the same with game developers. It doesn't matter if you're doing it part-time. It doesn't matter if you're doing it full-time. It doesn't matter if it's your bread and butter. If you're a game developer, you're a game developer. That's it. There's no shame in doing game development for a hobby. There's no shame in aspiring to do game development full-time. And I think once we look at it as just a passion, as just something you want to do and something you want to pursue, it'll tear down a lot of barriers because you do kind of see people, shun people because they're just hobbyists, or I can't talk to those people because they're pro game developers. You don't necessarily see that a lot with musicians. Even when I was starting out, playing bass at shows, I'd go up to musicians, maybe we'd be opening for a show. I'd go talk to, the headlining band and say, "Oh, you're so good, blah, blah, blah," and they'd say, "Hey, I listened to your set, you guys are really good, maybe do this, maybe do that, work on your stage presence or something a little bit." And there wasn't necessarily this artificial divide separating, somebody who's starting out from somebody who's been there. And I think as game developers, we can get a lot better with, getting rid of that term of hobby game developer and realize that there's a lot that we have in similar because we're all trying to pursue the same thing. We're all trying to create games, we're trying to create experiences that people enjoy, and we want to reach people. Picking back up. So just in kind of the next thought, there's a lot I think we can do. So we've talked about some of the ways that indie musicians and indie game developers are similar. I think there's a lot we can actually do together. So one of the things I've heard a lot is like, hey, I'm just getting started in game development. There's no other game developers in my small town of 2,000 people or something like that. Where do I find other game developers to work with? Obviously, there's places online like Twitter and TigSource where you can go to join online communities. But I think we should keep an eye out for indie musicians to hang out with. We're doing a lot of the same things. we're doing a lot of the same processes, we're pursuing creative ventures. So I think, game developers and indie musicians, we talk the same language. I think there's a lot we could really do to hang out together. So whether it just be you find some bands, hang out in the practice space and make games while they're making music, vice versa. I think just being in the same place opens up a lot of doors, opens up a lot of conversations for creativity and things like that. Another way I think game developers and indie musicians can work together is creating an art manifesto. So that's like a term that you don't really hear very much, and it's not super common. And I know that there's some game manifestos. Tale of Tales has the real-time art manifesto and things like that. But traditionally, in the past in art history, manifestos weren't necessarily limited to only games or only to music. What if you created an art manifesto that included, game developers, a poet, pottery artists, musicians? I don't see any reason to draw these lines between these different disciplines. So creating an art manifesto where you have, a core set of values, you have specific artistic ideas you want to express, things like that. I think would create for some interesting art. A lot of times game developers only pull inspiration from other games. Our game is X game plus Y game. Our game is X game minus Y game, or something like that. And that's absolutely awesome, but I think, what about if we have games that were inspired by a poem, or games that were inspired by the voice of your grandmother, or just different experiences that we don't necessarily think about as inspiring us to create games. Another way I think game developers and musicians can work together is the obvious one in hiring indie musicians to work on your games. The current game I'm working on, Art Club Challenge, right now, I'm actually hiring a local saxophonist. The soundtrack for the whole game will just be a solo saxophone. He's a real awesome guy. He's played with my brother's band. I've played with him. I was talking through some of my colleagues about creating minimalist art, creating minimalist music for my art game, and I just kind of was musing over just using one instrument, and this guy Nathan came to mind, and so my brother talked to him, so hopefully sometime next month we'll be setting up some time for him to record the music for my game. Obviously it benefits the musicians by providing them some income if you set up some kind of royalty agreement. And on the other side, it actually benefits your game because one, you're investing in local talent. Two, the musicians are actually really pumped about working on games. So they'll do some promotion as well, saying, hey, I just released the soundtrack for this game. You should go check it out. This is really cool. So there's a lot of cross-pollination and cross-promotion that can happen from working with local musicians on top of working with somebody from your hometown. The last kind of idea I have...
5 minutes.
Right. The last kind of idea that I have about indie musicians and indie game developers working together was partially inspired by an article. Then I just kind of realized it would be a crazy idea that I would love to see happen, is having an indie game developer go on tour with a band. So imagine a scenario where you had a indie band that worked on the soundtrack for a game, and once the band goes on tour, the game developer goes with them. Since we're doing a lot of the same things, I don't see any reason why the band sets up their merch booth. The game developer could set up a table next to them, promote their game, talk to fans while they're running the merch table about the game, saying, oh, your favorite band that's playing on stage actually did the soundtrack for this game. It's helping promote the game. The game is helping promote the artist. You can work out some kind of royalty split. But that's my kind of crazy idea that I think might produce some really cool art and some really cool stories for sure. So just kind of in conclusion, I think that not just musicians, I think there's a lot of creative pursuits that game developers can look to for inspiration, look to for alternative business models, look to for just different ways of approaching the craft of making games. Specifically, me being a musician, I made those parallels between me and my brother, him doing music and self-promotion, me doing games and self-promotion, that there was a lot of similarities there. But I don't think that the door closes there. I mean, I think there's a lot of other industries we can learn from, and more importantly, work together with. And I would just love to see, games created and inspired by new experiences, and playing those games and seeing what they'd be like. Yeah, and that's it. We have about 3 minutes for questions. Question.
Have you seen Keyboard Drum Set Fucking Werewolf?
No, I have not.
It's a game that was made for a band, which might be called Drum Set Fucking Werewolf. But it's set to one of their songs. So it's this crazy, kind of lo-fi Wolfenstein type running through the woods game about murder people. And it was done for this band, for their song. One of those, I think it was like an indie collaboration.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I'm definitely going to check that out. That's the kind of stuff that I'd love to see more of. Any other questions? All right, thanks.